This is the Alhambra Investments Weekly Market Pulse, where we look at some of the most significant things that we see over the last week. And Joe Calhoun, you said in your report this week that there were some strange things going on in the labor market. What did you mean by that?
Well, as I said in the piece, I think a lot of times we look at these national statistics and they may be obscure more than they reveal. And so we had an employment report last week, 559,000 jobs, I think it was, a little less than 500,000 in the private sector. And it was labeled as disappointing, which I guess it is. I mean, there were hopes, I guess, after the ADP report. ADP came in at, 900,000 or so. I guess there was hope that it was going to be a big number, a seven-digit number. Oh my goodness, a million jobs. But I think it's kind of hard to get upset about 559,000 Americans finding jobs. I think that's a good number. Uh, but these employment reports are always so subject to revision anyway. We don't really know what the number is. It's just a wag, as I put it in the report. Now, if you don't know what a wag is, I can't say that on here. This is a family show, but let's just say it's a wild guess. Um, But yeah, I got to thinking about it and thinking about something locally here where we've been out to a number of restaurants recently. And we've had, in some cases, one case, a restaurant said that they couldn't seat us for dinner because they didn't have cooks. Another one, a local, very high-end hotel here that has a very good restaurant. They don't have a chef. They don't have a head cook. They're making do with the line cooks at this point, and the wait staff, quite frankly, is getting a bit surly because they're all working extra long shifts because they don't have people. And so, in thinking about that, I mean, we live in kind of a unique town, but I started thinking about, well, why is that? And I think, kind of the standard answer from people has been, well, they've got these generous unemployment benefits, and so nobody wants to work. But it can't be that that's the case everywhere. That's just not. That doesn't sound like America to me. I mean, Americans like to work. So I did a little digging and I started looking in the BLS website and have this section where it tells you what the unemployment rate is by metropolitan area. And so I start looking at it and I discover that in my county, the unemployment rate is 3.6%, which is obviously a very good number. What was kind of shocking about that to me was that in September of 2019, which was the all-time low here, it was actually 1.8. So we haven't had an unemployment problem in our county. And it's like I said, it's fairly unique, but I thought it was unique anyway. But then I discovered in looking at these unemployment rates by metropolitan area that we're not unique at all. There are lots of places where the unemployment rate is even less than what it is here. So I hear people kind of scoff at this idea that there's a labor shortage, but in some areas there actually is. And when you really look at you dig into these numbers and you look at places like Utah, South Carolina, a lot of southern states, Alabama, Auburn, Alabama's in the top 20, Huntsville, Alabama's way up there. Places in Georgia, Richland County, which is Augusta, Georgia, which is not far from me, has a very low unemployment rate. Uh, so I try to think about is there some common theme, and there's really not. I mean, Augusta, for instance, has a big military presence. Here we have Savannah River Plant, which is a big federal employer. But in Utah, they don't have those things. I'll tell a little story. We have a client who is helping uh, her housekeeper's son go to college at University of Utah. She's paying for his school and paying for his apartment for him and his brother, who's also in school out there, but not at University of Utah. Anyway, she called one day. We were talking about him, and she said, he needs a job. And I said, well, I've got clients out there. Let me give him a call and see what we can find out. I said, I even have a client who is an adjunct professor at University of Utah. So I call up this client and I talk to him for a little bit, and he says, and he doesn't want a job. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, if he walks in one end of the mall and he gets all the way to the other side and he doesn't have a job yet, yeah, he doesn't want one. So I relayed this to our other client, and she was a tad upset. Anyway, needless to say, he has a job now because he got found out. But yeah, I mean, the unemployment rate in places in Utah is 2%. When you dig into these numbers, though, what you find is that the unemployment rate in the New York area is over 8%. The unemployment rate in Los Angeles is almost 10%, 9.9. Los Angeles is actually 377th out of like 400 metropolitan areas. 9.9% unemployment rate. And throughout California, the unemployment rates are all above normal, all above average. There's also a lot of places in Texas on that list, and that's makes sense too. We've had this shutdown in the shale industry where oil prices have not been high enough to support the shale drilling and so forth, so they can't get financing. So, Texas has done a great job of I think diversifying their economy. You look at a place like Austin now, which is kind of known as Silicon Valley, Texas, or something, but even so, they're still somewhat dependent on the energy sector for employment. The point is that I think that we don't know how things are changing right now, Bob. I think there's a lot of things going on in the economy. I think there's a lot of people who used to work service jobs who have decided they're not going to do that anymore. I think there's also this quality of life issue where I think a lot of people discovered during the pandemic that maybe that second income was costing them more than it was worth. So I suspect there's a lot of people who are not going to go back to work. So it's just a very interesting time, and I think to me, if you're going to understand what's going on with this economy, you're going to have to dig into the details. You can't just look at these national numbers and think that you're really getting the big picture because you're not.
Well, I think everybody agrees that we're in a recession because of COVID and a lot of other things that have taken place. But one thing you said that interested me is that this recession is different than any one in the last two generations.
I think it's even longer than that, really. I mean, look, this was a supply shock. I think people forget that we've been looking at this thing, economists, I think, in general, and government officials in particular, have been looking at this as a standard recession, and it's not. We shut down the economy. We shut down completely. It was a huge supply shock, and a supply-led recession is completely different than a demand-led recession. And all we've had in my lifetime, and as I said in the statement, in the weekly report, even in my dad's lifetime, were demand-led recessions. That's all we've ever had. So we applied those standard tools to this recession, but they don't fit. We handed people these all these checks, government stimulus, quote unquote, checks, as if, well, we just give them enough money, they'll go out and spend. Well, the problem wasn't they didn't have money. The problem was they didn't have anything to spend on. They couldn't go to restaurants. They couldn't take trips. They couldn't do these things. So handing them a bunch of cash didn't help. Now, obviously, there were people in the country who needed cash assistance because they needed to pay rent. They needed to, eat. I get that. But the vast majority of people in this country were able to work remotely or in some other form or fashion. They didn't need that extra money. It didn't help. It helped in the sense, I suppose, that we raised private savings, but we did it at the expense of a higher government debt. The point is that it was the wrong medicine for this problem. And I think we're still approaching it that way. I said in the piece too that, we've seen this in Japan. We keep copying Japan, thinking that Japan's problem is that they didn't do it enough. We did it with QE. Japan did QE long before we did. It never worked. And Ben Bernanke's explanation for that was that they didn't do it quickly enough and they didn't do it big enough. Well, we've been doing it for close to a decade and haven't worked here either. Now, apparently, we're going to copy them again. Throughout the 90s, Japan started the 90s with a debt to GDP ratio of about 65%, 66%. They're now at 250. And what did they spend the money on? Oh, infrastructure. They spent just decades of infrastructure. And you know what? Their infrastructure is great, and their economy still is near deflation. Now, for a lot of reasons, I think the Japanese economy is not as bad as people perceive it to be, but that's beside the point. The point is that they've had low growth and very low inflation, if not deflation, for a very long time, doing the things that we say we're going to do. And apparently, again, we believe that, oh, infrastructure spending will work. It didn't work in Japan because they didn't do enough of it. Well, I don't know. It seems to me that if you added that much debt to that economy and it didn't work, maybe we ought to be thinking about something else. It seems to me that what we have here right now, even with unemployment, is that workers aren't where the jobs are, or if they are where the jobs are, they're not qualified. Maybe those are the things we ought to be working on, rather than just again doing these infrastructure plans that may not do anything. Look, our infrastructure may need fixing, but I can tell you something: if you start building roads in South Carolina where the unemployment rate's this low, you better import some workers to build them because we don't have them. So, I said jokingly the thing that maybe if they want to stimulate the economy, they should provide people with an incentive to relocate. Uh, on the other hand, I'm a big believer in government doing as little as possible, because I generally think that politicians can screw things up, but rarely do they make things better. I'm not any better than they are. I don't know any more than they do in the sense of being able to figure out exactly what the economy needs. So, uh, as I said, let's not do something. Let's just stand there. So I think that's probably the best option in most cases. But it's just a very interesting time right now, Bob, from an economic standpoint. I think that there's just so many things going on that are different than what we've seen in the past. And I don't think we have really a good clue how they're going to turn out.
There was not a lot of significant economic data in all the reports that came in last week. Anything big coming up this week?
We're going to get a CPI report, which is the thing everybody's pointing to, which is on Friday, an inflation report. But, again, prices are going to go up. That's what they've done in every report in my lifetime, I think. I can't remember the last time we had a negative CPI number. Is it going to be too hot? I don't know. What's too hot? Listen, I'm one of those weird people that thinks that being close to deflation is probably not a bad thing. If we start raising prices at a higher rate, I can't see how that's good for the average person. Janet Yellen said something over the weekend about expecting that, thinking or saying that higher interest rates and higher inflation would be good for the economy. I just don't understand how people get that. How they get the idea that rising prices and make them rise faster is going to be better. The average person is never going to catch up in that environment. Their pay raises are never going to keep up with inflation. It's just not a great idea, but it is what it is, and the market will react however it reacts. I suspect that since there's been so much attention on the inflation numbers, maybe this one will be more benign. We've actually seen bonds do pretty well here lately, and I think that tells us something. So, this economic data that comes out every week, we talk about it, we look at it. Most of it doesn't mean nearly as much as people think it does.